Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for coming out. I recognize lots of faces, and in fact, an hour ago I was sitting in my office with Melissa going over, doing some advising. So great to see you all the engineering and bioengineering students here. Heather and I will sort of tag team this. Most of you, anyone in bioengineering, of course, knows Heather, and we'll do a little tag team. We'll have a little exercise for you to do, so it's some hands-on as well as a little bit of sort of I call it background more than theory. You can understand the challenge of this situation in that, we teach a 2-semester-long undergraduate course in communications, which I've taught for a number of years before I took a lot of the same ideas and created a graduate version of this. So I teach a year-long graduate course for PhD students on communication, which includes a big chunk on writing. And we're going to just boil that down to, I don't know, half an hour, 5 minutes. And so we'll give you the essentials, but we'll give you, what are hopefully starting points more than a complete story. And for those of you who are, not fortunate enough to be in the bioengineering program and have the benefit of the full year program, like I say, take up contact with us. We're happy to share materials with you, point you at places to find more materials and help improve your communications and specifically your writing skills. So that's sort of our big goal for today. This is a graphic that I think kind of covers the whole talk. And we'll work our way from the center to the outside of this and deal with each one of these points. And the reason that we set it up this way is sort of from the outside, audience is everything. That's always the thing you have in mind as you're designing any communication, whether it's a presentation like this or a piece of writing. And so it's very clear to have that in mind. But even before that, has to come what's in the middle, which is your message. And this is the part that may take a while to refine. You should have something you want to tell people that you're excited about, that you're convinced they might benefit from hearing. You have an idea, you have a piece of data, a finding from your research, you have a new mechanism your research has uncovered, and that's really your message. And that message has to be honed and refined and massaged and clarified, and you have to be able to talk about that message from every possible angle, before you're really ready to communicate it. So oftentimes what we find when people's writing starts to wander off and become a little vague and lack precision and clarity, it's because they really don't have a clear message. They don't really know what their message is. So when you find yourself, stuck there at your screens, trying to write something or trying to improve the bit of writing you already have, it's always a good place to go back and think, okay, what is it I really want to convey? What's the key element to my message? And that will help sort of drive it forward through these other layers, which are kind of structural layers, and we'll get to each one of those. And so oftentimes what we find in practice, of course, is that we have our important message, and we actually have to convey it to different audiences. So we go through this process. I'm going to walk you through each time a little differently, depending on whether I'm talking to a group of students or writing for a group of students or writing for my professional colleagues at a conference. Even if it's a conference, let's say, what sort of conference is it? Or if it's a journal, what kind of journal is it? Is it a journal in my field? Is it a more general bioengineering journal? Those things will change how I sort of march through. But at the core is always this idea. And there has to be that idea to really make anything happen. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, actually this year, this is sort of a new, I wouldn't say revelation, that's a bit strong, but a new realization for me this year. It comes out quite naturally when you teach this sort of content for a while. You think a lot about, well, what makes this hard? Like, why do students struggle with some of these ideas? Because, I've taught it for years and it's, I wouldn't say easy. It's always hard to think of good ways to communicate, but why does writing feel harder than speaking? Why, any one of you, if I put enough pressure on you, could probably stand up here and give a 3-minute talk about your research. But I would argue to sit down and do that same equivalent writing would be more work, would feel like more work. And it turns out that the science of communication supports that notion. And it says that while speaking is natural, reading and writing are not. So if you think back to the origins of man and the first interactions, there was obviously a spoken language, a spoken form of communication long before anyone came up with the idea of, well, let's write something down so that we know what to buy when we get to the prehistoric grocery store. And so writing emerged much later out of a different set of needs and a different set of conditions. And arguably isn't this sort of natural behavior. And when you think about it, the picture there of the children, children learn to speak and interact very quickly, in the first year or two of their lives. But it's not until much later that we force them to write. And one can even speculate, what would happen if you sort of let children grow and didn't have schools? Would they ever come up with the idea that writing was a good idea? I'm not sure. It has many practical applications, and so we do it, but it's not natural. And so the fact that it feels like work, that it takes more organized structure and lessons and practice and all these sort of pieces, it should actually feel like a natural thing. I didn't come through revelation through this particular citation here, this particular bit of science, but through this one. This is an amazing, actually, multifaceted scientist. I mean, he's a linguist by training, and he studies the psychology of language and how we understand language. And he's written a number of very, very well-known books, actually, in the area. His name is Steven Pinker. And recently, he wrote this book called The Sense of Style, which is the sort of guide to writing in the 21st century. And it's a wonderful resource that I'm still actually reading. I just found it before the semester started, and it's hard to get much reading time once the semester starts. But I'm using it, every time I read something new, I add something to a lecture or to some part of the teaching I do on this topic. And he again has pointed out very early on that writing is not natural. So it should feel like a different process than speaking, which is natural, which means it has to have some structure. So again, we need a message to start with, and what we build in after that are kind of the mechanics of the process. And so we want to have messages that are exciting, right? When you think about your research, there are parts of your research that you probably were excited about them when they first told you had to learn how to do them, and hopefully you still are doing them carefully, but you wouldn't call them the exciting parts of your research, right? I mean, every research has the boring parts, whether it's pipetting or running a program on some data, or there's those aspects to research. That's not really the key message you want to have. You want to distill what you're doing into some potential, let's say, for that research, some clinical application if it's medical, or somewhere you're going to change society, somewhere you're going to some notion of how your research, if successful, is going to change the world. That makes a typically exciting message, which is something you can build on, and it gives motivation to your whole story. And so it takes a while to find that. Focusing it is challenging. This is the hard part. It starts vague. It starts like, I do all these things and I have all these pieces to my research, and it's kind of bringing that lens down more and more to distill. I like to think of it as not a simplification process. It's not just subsampling, your ideas, taking every second word out of, your writing. It's a process really of distillation, of sort of boiling it all down, getting rid of the extra vapors you don't need, and saying what's left over at the end. That's the core idea. That's the essence of the focus. And we have to do that. And impact is the word that is useful to keep in your mind, because it's usually attractive to talk about things that are impactful. So if you're working on a research project, think a lot about what could be the impact if this research is successful. How will this change the world in which this research lives? Whether it's a medical world or another engineering world, every bit of research you do should have some impact, and you should become aware of it. If you're not, if you're sort of stuck in the lab doing these tasks and you're not really sure why, it's a great time to go talk to your mentors. It's a great time to sit down, now that you know enough about the research, sit down with the grad students or even the PI of the lab and say, can you tell me a little more about why all these tedious steps I'm going through, or these exciting steps I'm going through, where this is all leading, and what's the impact going to be when we're successful in this project. You should have a strong sense of that, because the stronger sense you have of that, the more likely you can convey it in your communications, in your writing and in your verbal communications. Now, once you have that message in place, the next piece is to think about, well, how do we convey that message? What's the framework, the way we tell our story? Because the way to think about your communication of your research is really as a story. And we have a long tradition of storytelling that goes back many generations, long before there was writing. right? Stories were told over campfires, and here's the traveling minstrel here in the upper left who travels around the country and tells the stories. The news, this is how news was conveyed, long before CNN. And so there's a tradition for doing this. And it's important to look at those traditional approaches and extract from them what the essentials were. And so there's a way to think about this that fortunately academics have spent some time thinking about. And one of them is in the modern era is Nancy Duarte. And Nancy's written several books. She's an amazing communicator herself. She is somebody who helps people develop their message and develop their presentations, oftentimes in the form of product launches, for example. So probably some of you may have seen these. Unfortunately, they don't happen this way anymore because Steve Jobs passed away. But Steve Jobs was famous for his releases of Apple products and the presentations he would give. There's whole books actually written about Steve Jobs' presentation style, and many people emulated it. It was a compelling way to get customers and all the people at these major Apple conferences excited about new products. And of course his successors try and do the same, and other companies try and do the same. And Nancy Duarte used to work for Apple and worked with Steve Jobs in some of these presentations. She also worked with Al Gore to produce the Uncomfortable Truth movie, which again, some of you may have seen. It's again a compelling story of the environment and why we should worry about it. And it turned Al Gore from a pretty stiff and unconvincing political leader into a very compelling speaker and somebody whose credibility I think people trusted when they saw him in the movie. And so she's very good at capturing this. And so she analyzed the story. She didn't come up with this particular graph down below here. It turns out that people who study plays and the story genre have come up with it, but there's structure to a story. A story just doesn't, if you go to a movie and watch a movie, it's not action. Well, some movies are action the whole time, but most good movies don't just have action the whole time, and they're not just boring the whole time, otherwise you don't watch them. But they start with some background, some introduction, they build up to some moment of climax, some big part of the story, maybe a couple of them, where the hero's life is in danger, or there'd be there's a threat, there's good against evil, and there's a moment when the two clash in some form of battle. And then there's a resolution of it, this falling action and eventual resolution. And she took that as a starting point, and then she analyzed talks, and she came up with this pattern. So this is hers. This is Nancy Duarte's analysis of some of the great speeches of our time. And she used this form of analysis on the Steve Jobs 2007 release of the original iPhone, and she applied it to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So two rather different examples, I think, and yet two pretty iconic moments in the past century. And she showed that this pattern actually works. And the idea of the pattern is that you start with what is, and then you say what could be. So you say here's, and you can, and the beauty of this structure is you can actually include it in your writing too. Because when you think about what is an introduction says, here's the world as we see it today. This is the technology we use to achieve this goal, and it sort of works, and it's made some progress, but I want to get you excited about what could be, that upper level. And so in the introduction, I want to already start to instill some sense of we could have a different level of sophistication, not just for sophistication's sake, but we could solve an engineering problem and create a world that doesn't have that problem in it anymore. We could create a new communication system that would allow people to stay in touch over limited bandwidth, right? That sounds very technical and boring, but if you portray it as a new way of communicating, a new level of interaction that we could achieve, then that is something exciting, and people get excited about it, and you get them on board with your project. And this sort of extends this going up and down, because you can't keep people excited the whole time, right? A good movie, doesn't keep you excited the whole time. It builds up, and there's sort of maybe a minor climax where the first encounter between good and evil happens, and then there's sort of a relaxation, and then it builds up again to maybe even a higher peak of excitement where the two foes really meet head to head, and eventually builds up and builds up. And so she says you can repeat that over a longer period of communication, whether it's a talk or a writing, piece of writing. And then finally at the end, there's what she calls the new bliss. This is this description, this description of the impact, this summary of the impact. And again, this fits very well in the notion of scientific discourse, because when we think about it, at the end of our writing, we really should be able to encapsulate what will the world be? How will the world look if our research is successful? And so this summarizes that new vision for a future that includes your successful outcomes in your research. And she said many talks, many good presentations, verbal presentations look this way, but it's a structure that can be carried over into other forms of writing. And other people have picked up on this notion. So, and another perspective on presentation in general, I think it helps a lot when you're giving verbal presentations, but I think it carries over to writing as well, is when you think about how to tell the story, to think about what your role is in the story. And your role is the storyteller, the minstrel traveling around, passing the word. And in the story pattern and the roles, you're not really the hero. You're not really the hero. You're not Luke Skywalker. As a storyteller, you're Yoda. So, so your role as a communicator is to be the one capturing this excitement and conveying it to your audience, to the world out there that wants to, that you really want to grasp that idea. You want them to get excited about what your research is. And so your role is not the hero. You may be the doer of some of the action, but your role as a communicator is the role of Yoda, of taking this knowledge, of telling this story. And so, I find this a useful lesson, especially in presentation situations, because it's very easy to get nervous in a presentation, right? I mean, anyone who's not nervous, like I tell my students, is probably on drugs, or is really not prepared to give a talk. And so a little nervousness is good, but how do you control that? And one way to control it, and one way to see your role is that, I'm not here, because of me. I'm here because communication is important, and we have some great ideas we've learned from communication, and it's those ideas that are the heroes of this session right now. And I'm just here to tell you about it. That's my role. So why should I be nervous? I'm just here to help you, enjoy what we find exciting and worthwhile in this notion of communication. So yeah, you're not Luke Skywalker, you're Yoda. So that's the big picture of the story. And of course, you have to get down to details at some point. And you have to have paragraphs and sentences and words when you go to write things. And we know some things about how to effectively organize paragraphs and sentences and the way you choose your words to convey information in science. And and that takes some learning. That takes some reading consciously, takes some trial and error, takes some understanding. This is part of the process. This is why we teach a whole year course on it. This is I can't give you the essence of this even in a couple of minutes. But it's this it's this sort of recurring pattern. It has a certain structure to it, and there are some guidelines for it. And there are things like old information to new information. So one of the ways we tell stories, when you think about it, is if you're telling even a joke, right? You're telling a joke to somebody. You tell the story of, I was walking down the street the other day, and that's well-known information. At the end of the joke is some funny perspective, some new look at a situation. And that's the new information. And it's no different in science. We start with what we know. We describe here we are today, and this is our state of our knowledge in this particular discipline, in our domain. And we want to move then into the newer information. And so when we think about the order in which we structure our ideas, it's useful to think about it as going from the old to the new. That creates a natural flow of information, and it makes it easy for people to sort of engage and absorb that information, because that's ultimately what good writing should do. And so there's some structural things like that we'll talk about. And Heather will talk about some of those in our exercise. We'll get into it. There's some other sort of rules of thumb that you can apply to the organization of things. You can, for example, couple two ideas. You bring one idea up as a sentence, and the words that are at the end of that first sentence become the words of the concept that begin the next sentence. And then sentences fit together in a structured and logical way. So the idea is, there's sort of a glue that, that is naturally there between the end of one thought and the beginning of the next thought. They form a logical progression of ideas. And so there are rules like that we can apply. So again, there's lots more we could say about this, and Heather will talk more about that in the exercise. So finally, who's the audience? Like I say, we set that up right from the beginning as something to keep in our minds. The first question I always ask when I got in, when Stephanie said, would you give this talk? The first question, this was last year, was, okay, who's the audience? Who are the group I'm going to be talking to? And that's key to devise the language you use, the level of the presentation, all those sort of decisions you make. So you should always have a clear idea when you start your writing exercise, who is it that's actually likely to read this? One of the really interesting ideas that I learned a few years ago was that the majority of people who read our scientific output, so we as scientists and engineers who write our papers and publish them in journals, the majority of people who actually consume that material are not native English speakers. So English has become the dominant language in science to the point where any journal, any publication that anyone's likely to read over the entire world is likely to be written in English. And so the responsibility on us as writers is to take those readers into consideration and realize that, oh my goodness, they're not native English speakers. They're not going to fully comprehend the world in which we live, the culture from which this text emerges. Right? We all have a cultural background, a world in which we live. We have perspectives on life that convey into vocabulary, into words we use, into parallels we draw. And we have to be careful about how we use our sense of irony, our sense of humor. What's the hardest thing when you learn a second language? The last thing to come to you when you learn a second language is when you start to appreciate the humor that is sort of in that language. And it's not that the language has a special humor, it's that the culture from which the language comes has its form of humor. And so it's hard to absorb that, it's hard to get to that point. And so if you want to communicate effectively, you have to take that into consideration and try and limit the use of things that are culture specific in your writing. And not to make it boring, not to make it stilted, not to throw half your favorite vocabulary away, but just to realize, okay, somebody has to be able to read this who maybe doesn't understand my cultural background. And yet we're all sharing the same language. It's the huge advantage that most of us who either are North Americans or trained here have in the world of science, is that we just happen to have a big leg up, but we also have a big responsibility when we write to convey to those people who are not native English speakers. So that's just one of the aspects of the language and the audience to keep in mind. So now we're going to switch over and do an exercise, and I'll pass the microphone to Heather. And this is the exercise we're going to use, and she'll have some handouts, I think, or has passed out.
I don't have pockets today. I didn't even think about it.
Around the little tie in the front?
No, I'll just hold it. All right, so the activity that we're going to do is very much in alignment with what Rob was already talking about, this notion of old information to new information. But we're going to be talking about it not broadly, like big picture down to the narrow focus, but rather literally on the sentence level. Because it works, as you saw in the image before, a couple images before, on that fractal level. Not only does it work big picture ways, this old information to new information, but it literally works at that very narrow sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph level. So we're going to start with the basics. I need you all to divide into groups so that there are 10 groups. I'm guessing 3 or 4 per. I'll tell you if you don't. Just do it. I have no problem telling people what to do.
I can attest.
Yeah, poor Rob. So Chase, you go with these guys, right? And you too, if you want. You 4. Cool. You 3. Yes. Don't cheat. You already did it. You already did it. Okay, cool. So, we're good? Everybody have a team? All right. So, wait. Before you open your envelope, this is the very special privileged information. What you're going to do is, this is from an introduction that I revised to follow the pattern that I want you to learn. From a student who took my thesis class last year. This is the second paragraph in his introduction. This is the first paragraph in his introduction. The reason why I'm giving you the first paragraph is because how else will you know where the second paragraph should begin? So what I want you to particularly pay attention to in these sentences that you have is 1, remember it's the second paragraph following this. So there's a relationship there. Also look for those patterns in how a sentence is beginning or ending and try to put the sentences in the correct order. Does that make sense? Okay, so go to it. That's why I was telling you, don't cheat. I only needed 9. everybody. Looks like everybody, all the teams are basically done or have given up, and that's fine too. So I'll show you the answer. Can I just tap on it?
Yep.
All right, so first, the very first sentence. The early detection of CRC. Okay, that's sentence number 1. Sentence number 2 is the polyps. Always good times. The next sentence is the utility. They found, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So raise your hands if you got it right. Yeah, because Lindsay. All right, so quick question. First and foremost, why did you get it right? Now you get to articulate what you experienced in this activity. Why did you get it right? Yeah.
Well, first off, we had to read all the sentences just to have an idea of what content there was, and then we tried looking for like an introduction, I don't know, sentence.
Like a topic sentence?
A topic sentence and a conclusion sentence. Couldn't really figure it out. But we slowly started, we were able to piece together like, okay, these 2 topics go in this order, and slowly we kind of built the whole thing together and ended up being the right answer.
Right. So if you look at, for example, the very end of this sentence, polyps, right? What's the first word in the sentence right next to it? Okay, so the teaching experience that I want to impart to you at this moment is don't just, oh, thanks, Rob. Don't just do the training wheels effect, meaning you end the sentence and you put the same word in the next sentence. If you want to familiarize yourself with how to move in paragraphs from old information to new information, feel free to do the match. But that is going to be draft 1. Actually, it's probably more like draft 3, because you have to get your ideas out first. But the other sentence, think about it like this. So look at sentence utility, the utility of these, and then the next sentence after that is they found. So that's more complex, not match, right? So you end with complexity and limitations, performance complexity and limitations. Does that match up with they found? No, it's not match. However, the referent, meaning what they is referring to, is pretty easy to identify. Who are they? Right. So this is a more complex approach than the match. So thinking about like that core idea in the sentences and making sure that they string together in a very coherent and logical way that is obvious to your reader. Now, if I would have given you the original, this activity would have been a lot harder. Not because it was a bad paragraph, it's just that some of these techniques needed to be employed a little bit more thoroughly. As I was mentioning before, when I said draft 3, that wasn't sort of in jest. Like, one thing that Rob and I both talk about often is this notion of also the writing of, the distilling your own writing and doing multiple passes. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sorry to pass the mic here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that, again, I spend kind of a part of a lecture on is strategies for doing the editing that you do, right? You do your first pass, you read it through, and you realize, oh, I better do a second pass. But what is the organization you use? What is the strategy you use to do those multiple iterations through a bit of writing? And the reason we set up the courses, both the graduate and the undergrad we do, the undergrad course the way we do, is so that you take a relatively small piece of writing and go over it multiple times. And that points to a natural strategy, which is not to just read your text from beginning to end and try and solve every problem that's in that writing. So not to be looking for typos, poor choice of words, poor order of words in a sentence, poor order of sentences in a paragraph. all those things that you need to be looking out for. And there's a pretty long laundry list of things to check in writing. It's much easier to go through a piece of writing and say, this pass, the purpose of this pass is to look for structure going from, let's say, old to new material, to look for a cohesion of the sentences from one to the other to form paragraphs. And so this approach of doing multiple passes with a limited set of goals for each pass is usually a more efficient way to get to the end result. Because it's very common to get halfway through a paragraph and have corrected 3 or 4 different aspects of the paragraph and completely lose the thread of what the paragraph is even about. You just lose any sense of, especially the flow of the content from beginning of paragraph to the end of paragraph. Another way to think about the process is that it consists of 3 different roles. So the writer is one role, and the proofreader is another role, and the editor is a third role. And it's hard enough to do 2 things at once. It's really hard to do 3 things at once. So when you're the writer, your job is to create the content, but then switch hats and just read it as a proofreader. Just read it as if it were, try and dissociate yourself from the text, which is obviously challenging. But give it a day, give it a couple of days where you haven't looked at it, bring it back out again, and then read it through. But read it through as the proofreader, which means that you're just looking for places that are not clear. You're looking for words that are vague. You're looking for kind of problems that need fixing, but with no notion of what the fix will be, because that's what the editor really does. That's the third role, and that's a third pass that you can do through the writing to say, okay, now that I've marked up or underlined or did something to identify those spots that need work, now I can focus on those and say, okay, how am I going to fix that? And do that as another pass. So breaking the whole iterative writing process down into multiple passes, each with a particular purpose, is going to typically lead to better results in the end. And more effective. And the other cool part about it is that it's incredibly practical, because oftentimes it's intimidating to think, I have this 10-page paper and now I have to proofread it and edit it and fix it and do all these things at once. I mean, you have to set aside, hours, a substantial amount of time for that. Whereas if you say, no, I'm just going to read it through once and see if it flows. That's something you can probably do in 10 or 15 minutes, even with a longer piece of text. And then you can get that done, mark it up, and then you've accomplished something, and you can go out and play more baseball or whatever. And then come back later and do another pass, before dinner, and then have your dinner. And so you can break up the whole iterative rewriting process into little manageable chunks. So it doesn't seem quite so terrifying. Right? There's nothing worse about a task when it seems so huge and I've got to be in the right mood and I've got to be awake and I've got the right level of food in my stomach and the sky has to be, you feel all these kind of conditions before you even start the process. And of course what happens, you just put it off until, oh my God, it's due tomorrow. I really have to do it tonight. And even though it's not the right time of day for me to be doing this. So if you can break writing down into manageable chunks, then you can spread it out throughout your day, throughout your week, and I think ultimately produce a better result. That's been my experience. I like to say, especially the grad students, but I think it's true to undergrads, that writing and reading related to writing should really be part of every day. We communicate, we talk every day, most of us. It's rare to have a day where you don't talk to somebody, right, or listen to somebody. And writing is a hard form of communication to learn, and it really benefits from this revisiting, revision process. And so it's a great experiment to say, okay, let's try every day for a week. I'm going to work a little bit on some writing assignment, because you all have writing assignments that you're in the midst of, right? Every course has something that has some writing in it, and just say, I'm going to try for a week where I'm going to plan ahead, not do it all the night before. I'm really going to do a little bit of writing every day, and then experiment and see, okay, what time of day is good for me? What is the best time of day for me to do some proofreading? When's a good time of day for me to produce some new text, to generate some new paragraphs that I need for my writing? And you'll eventually find that there's a pattern that's different for every one of us. Some of us are fabulous at 2 in the morning. And others are great when we first wake up in the morning. And experiment with that a little bit, and you'll find that you'll find a groove. You'll find a time of day when it works well for you. And then it becomes part of your regular rhythm. And then every new writing assignment is not this terrifying, daunting, monument you have to deal with. It's like, oh, another assignment. Good, I'll break it into pieces and turn my crank, and in no time it'll be done, and I won't be stressed.
Okay.
What else do you want to talk about?
So on that same note, going back again This is like the visual of like the going back again, back and forth. Stuart has some handouts that I produced for you, and Rob and I co-compiled this together. And one of the things I want to focus on is, yet again, something pretty basic. So we talked about old information to new information. Now we're going to talk about how we process information as readers and how that informs our ability to better write for our readers. And there are just like other tips and hints and helps. So you get a whole packet. We're only going to talk about like one of the things on it. Is there enough? Oh, also, if you can gather up the little slips of paper, I'm really heavily into recycling. So if you could put them back in the envelopes and make sure I get them back, that would be really helpful for me. I'll probably use them again next year. Oh, rats. All right. So the thing I want to focus on is in the packet underneath the I don't have it memorized. He's going to share with me. Under the keys to technical writing, so it's the heading information processing, memory, and writing. Okay, so what I want you to do is think, and I'm just going to summarize this for you. How many of you, it says, but you can cheat if you want. How many of you have heard about how many things we can keep in our heads at any one time? Yeah, 7 plus or minus 2. Some are better. Meaning some people are better at remembering elements than others. Some people are worse than others. But what I want you to do is think about that items 7 to plus or minus 2 as elements in a sentence, verbs and nouns, right? When we look and read as readers, when we're processing, we literally just ditch, if we're already familiar with the language we're reading in, the words like the, and so articles, those are gone. Prepositions, in, on, around, gone. We're literally looking at verbs and nouns. That's what tells us what's happening in the sentence. So if a sentence has more than 7 plus or minus 2 things going on, verbs and nouns, what does that tell you about your processing as a reader? Yeah, it's going to be harder, right? So one thing to keep in mind as you move forward is this notion of keeping your sentences limited to about 25 words. That's including articles and prepositions, again. So bringing those back in, you got about 25 words. That's about all we can process in one sentence without starting to get a little confused. And then lastly, I'm just going to read this last bit. It's by Wiley, 2009. So the longer your sentences, the less your readers will understand, according to research by the American Press Institute. The study shows that when the average sentence in a piece was fewer than 8 words long, readers understood 100% of the story, all that they read. Even at 14 words, they could comprehend more than 90%. However, you jump up to 43-word sentences and comprehension dropped below 10%. So from a very practical standpoint, you literally need to go in and go through, do a pass. Use your word count function and count your words and think about verbs and nouns, because these things are what are telling us what's going on. And if we can't understand what's going on, then we're not going to understand what you're trying to write. So if you think about that in a reciprocal fashion, as a reader, right, you know that this is going to decrease, right? So then as a writer, you can help support your audience by limiting your words. So, Rob, any last thoughts?
Oops. Okay. So I guess I'll close with something that kind of led us into this, and it's this notion that writing is hard. Writing will take some time for you to develop. The good news is that there's some people who've gone before and who can help you with this process. And there's some references in the slides here. This is a book that I discovered relatively recently, although it's been around for a long time. There's actually a 13th edition now. And I love the title of it. It's Lessons in Clarity and Grace. And these are important words to keep in mind, especially in the world of scientific language, where clarity is so important. If there's one thing we want to achieve in our writing, it's to be clear and ideally unambiguous. Right? Science is full of important details. They can be methodological, they can be interpreting the data, they can be mechanistic ideas, and clarity there is incredibly important. So clarity is always the goal. Whenever you're trying to make decisions about writing in science, and you have to trade off between elegance, let's say, and clarity, or length of a sentence and clarity, or sophistication of the language, the words you use and clarity, clarity always wins. So the clarity is the key concern, the key goal in scientific writing. And yet, I love the notion that you can achieve clarity and also some grace. And so good writing in science has grace, has this sort of beauty to it that takes us away from this endlessly boring passive sentences that many articles tend to use in the methods section. Read the methods sections of lots of scientific articles and you'll see this really boring sentence after boring sentence all in the passive voice. And it'll read like about as well as your typical laundry list. And yet good writing is different from that. So clarity always wins, and there are books like this that can help you with that process. And they include things like here's 10 principles of writing clearly. There are these distilled lists that thoughtful authors like this have created, that are good things to keep in mind as we're doing our editing and as we're doing our writing. So they can be good motivations. Each one of these can be the driver for a pass through your text. So for example, you can say, I don't know, let's pick one, conciseness, right? So clarity, oftentimes, Heather's just explained to you why short sentences are effective. That's essentially being concise. And so you can say, I need to be concise. So I'm going to pass through my text and look to try and be concise. And there's even some little clues here. Cut meaningless and repeated words and obvious implications. Put the meaning of phrases into one or two words. So take something that's a whole phrase and try and distill it down to a couple of words. Prefer affirmative sentences to negative ones. So those are ways to be more concise. So you can do a pass through your writing, looking for each one of these 10 elements. And good books now seem to include more and more of these sort of lists of particular aspects to look at. So whenever you're not sure, you get something back and they say it's a B, do it again. And you're not really sure what to do next, these lists can be really helpful. You can sort of march your way through these lists, read your text based on these lists, and realize, oh yeah, my sentences are getting above 20 words or 25 words. Probably they're not understandable at this point. Probably I'm not as concise as I could be. And these form really good clues, I think, for how to do things. Here's 10 different ones. I'll say we'll post these and put them around. These are some things that I've distilled out of my own writing, and that are useful. These are
all in your packet.
Yes, they're all there. So these are things to look at and use. And then there are some some books we've mentioned and talked about and have used. These are not just books that look good on a shelf because the spine is a nice color. These are books we all very actively use in the courses we teach, and so they form great references to go to. So again, writing is hard, but it's manageable, it's doable. Everybody can improve their writing. Nobody's born a good writer. And you just have to be, like with any engineering discipline, you have to be organized and methodical and try some things and get some feedback, and you can always improve your writing. Okay, any questions now? We've covered a bunch of material, in a concise way, but I'm sure that, yes?
Back on the subtitle of that book, it was like Clarity and Grace.
Yeah.
So I understand what it's meant by being concise and clear. I'm not necessarily sure what it means by grace.
Grace, yeah. So if you talk to a writer of, let's say, a novel, literary writer, creative writer, then they would always strive for grace in their writing. So grace means a certain symmetry to the writing, a certain balance to it, a certain natural flow to the writing. The thing that makes a good book, the kind of thing we can't put down, right? That comes from, I would argue, is part of the grace of writing. And there's a great skill involved in that, and it's at the heart of creative writing. And I think it's, just as it's inappropriate to separate what movies and the structure of movies tell us and stories tell us from our scientific writing, to pretend those live in two different worlds. I think the same thing is true about scientific writing. I think we can achieve scientific writing that actually reads well, that actually has that grace and symmetry and natural flow, so that, maybe it's not quite as exciting as your latest whodunit, but at least it's easy to read. You may actually be able to put it down, before you fall asleep, but it should be something that's easy to read. And that's, I think, what comes when you make sure to include the graceful aspects of writing. Because writing is beautiful. I mean, this is why it's a literary form. It's a form of art. And I think it's wise for us to say, there's just as, when you think about graphics in science, right? We do graphs in science. And you look at some of those graphics and you think, those are beautiful. You look at some of the visualizations that we see of our data, and you look at that could hang in an art exhibit. And we've actually done this. We've taken some of the scientific output that comes out of the Ski Institute. We got an invitation to go up to the Kimball Arts Center in Park City and to put on a display of scientific art. And we took some of the displays that, again, totally came out of the need to publish or to convey our science, and they were just attractive. They were just appealing to the eye. They were intriguing and interesting. And we had a show of the top 20 pieces or something. And so I think there's lots we can learn on the writing side, of the same equation. To say our writing shouldn't be stiff and boring and repetitive. It should have a certain grace that makes it fun to read. Other questions? All right, well, if not, we're pretty easy to track down if you have questions. And so please feel free to do that, and I'll thank you all for your attention.
Yep, thank you very much.